Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a lonely rancher who found a native baby by the railroad tracks. Matthew Crawford discovered the infant wearing his dead wife's necklace, buried 3 years earlier, sparking an impossible mystery. But the truth was more impactful than anyone could have imagined. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. The discovery by the tracks. The October wind of 1892 cut across the Wyoming Territory with the kind of bitter edge that promised an early winter. Matthew Crawford pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse along the railroad tracks that ran past his property, checking for stray cattle that might wander onto the rails and cause problems with the next freight train. At 41, Matthew was a man carved by grief and solitude. 3 years had passed since consumption had taken his wife, Sarah, leaving him alone on the 1,000-acre ranch they had built together from nothing. His weathered face and graying temples told the story of a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, choosing isolation over the risk of further heartbreak. The railroad tracks served as the northern boundary of his property, a steel lifeline that connected his remote corner of Wyoming to the outside world. Twice weekly, freight trains passed through carrying supplies and cattle to markets in Cheyenne and Denver, their whistles echoing across the empty landscape like lonely calls in the wilderness. As Matthew approached the spot where Willow Creek passed under the railroad bridge, his horse suddenly shied and snorted nervously. The bay gelding, named Thunder, had been his companion for 6 years and wasn't easily spooked by ordinary sights or sounds. "Easy, boy," Matthew murmured, patting Thunder's neck while scanning the area for whatever had disturbed the animal. That's when he heard it, a sound so unexpected in this desolate place that he thought his ears were playing tricks on him. It was crying, the unmistakable wail of an infant coming from somewhere near the railroad bridge. Matthew dismounted quickly and approached the sound on foot, his heart racing with possibilities. No settlements existed for 20 miles in any direction, and the nearest town was a hard day's ride south. The presence of a baby in this wilderness made no sense. Following the cries, Matthew found himself looking down into the shallow ravine where Willow Creek meandered under the railroad bridge. There, nestled in a makeshift cradle of woven grasses and buffalo hide, was a Native American infant who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The baby was healthy and alert, crying with the robust voice of a child who had been well cared for until very recently. Traditional Apache clothing suggested the infant's tribal heritage, but what made Matthew's blood turn to ice was what he saw around the baby's tiny neck. Sarah's necklace. Matthew dropped to his knees beside the improvised cradle, his hands trembling as he reached for the familiar piece of jewelry. It was definitely Sarah's, a delicate silver chain with a small turquoise pendant that he had given her on their first wedding anniversary. He had buried her wearing that necklace, placing it around her neck with his own hands 3 years ago. "This can't be possible," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible over the baby's cries. He examined the necklace more closely, looking for any sign that it might be a copy or a similar piece. But the slight dent in the silver chain, the particular way the turquoise was set in its mount, even the tiny scratch on the pendant's surface that Sarah had gotten while gardening, every detail was exactly as he remembered. The baby's crying intensified, and Matthew forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis. Whatever mystery surrounded the necklace would have to wait. This infant needed care, and the October temperature was dropping rapidly as afternoon gave way to evening. Matthew gently lifted the baby from the grass cradle, noting the soft deerskin wrapping and the obvious care that had gone into the child's placement. This wasn't abandonment. Someone had deliberately left the infant here in this specific location, with careful preparation for the baby's comfort and safety. "Shh, little one," Matthew said softly, surprised by how naturally the infant settled in his arms. "Let's get you somewhere warm." As he prepared to carry the baby back to his horse, Matthew noticed something else that made his chest tighten with emotion. Tucked into the cradle beside where the infant had been lying was a small bundle wrapped in calico cloth, the same blue and white pattern that Sarah had loved and used for her own sewing projects. Inside the bundle, Matthew found several items that made his head spin with confusion and grief. There was a hand-carved wooden rattle that looked Apache in origin, a small pouch of what appeared to be dried herbs, and most shocking of all, one of Sarah's hair ribbons, a piece of yellow silk that she had worn on the day they were married. Matthew sat heavily on a nearby boulder, the baby still crying in his arms, trying to make sense of what he was discovering. Sarah had been buried with her jewelry and personal effects. Her grave, marked by a simple wooden cross, sat on a hill overlooking their ranch house. Matthew visited it every Sunday, keeping the site well maintained and free of weeds. Yet here was definitive proof that items buried with his wife had somehow found their way to a Native American infant left beside railroad tracks in the middle of nowhere. "Who are you?" Matthew asked the baby, though he knew no answer would come. "And how do you have my Sarah's things?" The infant's cries began to subside as the warmth of Matthew's body and the gentle rocking motion provided comfort. Dark eyes, alert and intelligent, looked up at Matthew with the trusting gaze that only babies possessed. Matthew made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Whatever mystery surrounded this child's appearance and the presence of Sarah's belongings, he couldn't leave an infant to die in the wilderness. The baby needed food, warmth and care, things Matthew could provide, even if he had no idea how to care for such a young child. "All right, little one," Matthew said, standing carefully and walking toward his horse. "We're going home, and tomorrow we're going to figure out how you came to be here with my wife's necklace." As thunder carried them both toward the ranch house, Matthew found himself thinking about Sarah and wondering what she would have made of this extraordinary situation. She had always wanted children, always believed that their isolated ranch needed the laughter and joy that only a child could bring. Now, 3 years after her death, a baby had appeared as if in answer to her unspoken prayers, wearing her necklace and carrying her belongings. Matthew didn't believe in miracles or supernatural intervention, but he couldn't deny that this discovery felt like something beyond mere coincidence. As the ranch house came into view and the baby settled peacefully in his arms, Matthew wondered if his life of solitude was about to end in the most unexpected way possible. Searching for answers. Matthew spent the first night caring for the baby with clumsy but determined hands. He had no experience with infants, but instinct and desperation guided him through the basics. The child seemed healthy and alert, accepting water mixed with canned milk and settling into makeshift bedding by the fireplace. As dawn broke over the Wyoming landscape, Matthew examined Sarah's necklace more carefully in the morning light. Every detail confirmed what he already knew. This was definitely his wife's jewelry, the same piece he had placed around her neck at burial. "This doesn't make sense," Matthew muttered, turning the pendant over in his palm. The baby watched him with curious dark eyes from the improvised crib Matthew had fashioned from a wooden crate and old blankets. After feeding the child again, Matthew made a difficult decision. He needed answers, and the only place to start was Sarah's grave. The thought of disturbing his wife's resting place made his stomach churn, but the mystery demanded investigation. Loading the baby into a canvas sling across his chest, Matthew rode the mile to the hilltop cemetery where Sarah lay buried. The small, fenced plot contained only her grave, marked by a weathered wooden cross bearing her name and dates. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Matthew whispered as he dismounted, "but I need to understand what's happening." Using a shovel he'd brought from the ranch, Matthew began the heartbreaking task of opening his wife's grave. With each shovelful of earth, his hands trembled more violently. The baby remained quiet, as if sensing the solemnity of the moment. 3 feet down, Matthew's shovel struck wood. His wife's simple pine coffin was intact, showing no signs of disturbance. With shaking hands, he cleared enough dirt to open the lid. What he found inside stopped his heart. Sarah's body was gone. In its place lay a collection of river stones, arranged roughly in the shape of a human form. Her burial dress was there, neatly folded, along with her other jewelry and personal effects. But the necklace and hair ribbon were missing, now in the possession of the native baby Matthew had found. Matthew collapsed beside the empty grave, his mind reeling. "What happened here?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking. The baby began to fuss, and Matthew forced himself to focus. Whatever had occurred, standing in a graveyard wouldn't provide answers. He needed to find someone who might understand what he was dealing with. After carefully refilling the grave and saying a prayer over the disturbed earth, Matthew rode toward the small settlement of Willow Springs, 20 miles south. The trading post there served scattered ranchers and occasionally hosted visits from peaceful native tribes. Joe Martinez, the trading post owner, was sweeping his porch when Matthew arrived with the baby. Joe's weathered face showed surprise at seeing the normally reclusive rancher, especially carrying an infant. "Matthew Crawford," Joe called out. "Haven't seen you in months. That's quite a bundle you're carrying." "Joe, I need to ask you something," Matthew said, dismounting carefully. "Have there been any Apache bands through here recently?" "Matter of fact, yes," Joe replied, studying the baby with interest. "Small group came through about a week ago. Peaceful folks, mostly women and children. They were asking about burial customs." "Burial customs? Strange thing," Joe continued. "They wanted to know about white people's burial practices, how we bury our dead, what we put in the graves with them. I figured they were just curious about our ways." Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. Did they mention anything specific? Anything about taking things from graves? Joe's expression grew serious. "You having trouble with grave robbers, Matthew? That's a serious charge to make against anyone." "I'm not making charges," Matthew said quickly. "I'm just trying to understand something that happened." "Well," Joe said thoughtfully, "the Apache woman who seemed to be their leader called herself Maria Crow Feather. She spoke pretty good English, said something about honoring the dead by keeping their spirits close to the living." "What does that mean?" "Near as I could tell, some tribes believe that taking personal items from the dead and giving them to children helps the spirits watch over the next generation. It's supposed to be an honor, not theft." Matthew stared down at the baby in his arms, processing this information. "Joe, if someone took items from a grave and gave them to a child, what would that mean?" "Depends on the tribe and the circumstances," Joe replied. "But generally, it would mean they're trying to connect that child to the spirit of the deceased. Maybe they believe the dead person is meant to guide or protect the child." The baby chose that moment to grab at Sarah's necklace around Matthew's neck. He had put it on that morning, unable to bear leaving it behind. The infant's tiny fingers wrapped around the pendant with surprising strength. "That baby seems mighty attached to that jewelry," Joe observed. "Where did you say you found this child?" "By the railroad tracks near my property," Matthew answered honestly. "And Joe, this necklace belonged to my wife. She was buried wearing it 3 years ago." Joe's eyes widened with understanding. "Matthew, I think that Apache band left this child specifically for you to find. If what Maria told me is true, they believe your wife's spirit is meant to watch over this baby. But why? Why my wife? Why this child?" "Can't say for certain," Joe admitted. "But Apache folks believe strongly in signs and spiritual connections. Maybe they had a vision, or maybe this child is special in some way that called to your wife's spirit." Matthew looked down at the baby, who had stopped fussing and was now watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. For the first time since Sarah's death, Matthew felt something other than grief and loneliness. He felt purpose. "What do I do now?" Matthew asked. "Near as I can tell," Joe said with a slight smile, "you've got yourself a baby to raise, and if the Apache folk are right, you've got your wife's blessing to do it." As Matthew prepared to ride home, he realized that his life had indeed changed forever. The mystery of how this child came to possess Sarah's belongings might never be fully solved, but perhaps understanding wasn't as important as accepting the gift he'd been given. For the first time in 3 years, Matthew Crawford was no longer alone, learning to be a father. 2 weeks passed as Matthew struggled to adapt to life with an infant. The baby, whom he had started calling Little Fox after noticing the child's alert, clever expressions, proved to be both demanding and rewarding in ways Matthew had never imagined. Each day brought new challenges. Matthew had to learn about feeding schedules, diaper changes, and the subtle differences between cries that meant hunger, discomfort, or simple need for attention. His calloused rancher's hands, more accustomed to rope and branding irons, fumbled with tiny buttons and delicate baby clothing. "You're a patient little one," Matthew said one morning as he attempted to dress Little Fox in clean clothes. "Your mama would have done this much better." The mention of Sarah no longer brought the sharp stab of grief it once had. Instead, Matthew found himself talking to the baby about his wife, sharing memories and stories as if Little Fox could understand every word. On a crisp November morning, Matthew was hanging laundry when he noticed riders approaching across the prairie. 3 figures on horseback were coming from the north, moving with the easy grace that suggested Native Americans rather than white settlers. Matthew quickly gathered Little Fox and retreated to the porch, his hand resting on his rifle while keeping the weapon out of sight. The baby seemed unusually alert, making soft cooing sounds as the riders drew closer. The leader of the group was an Apache woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair braided with beads, and wearing traditional dress mixed with some pieces of white clothing. Behind her rode 2 younger men who appeared to be her sons or nephews. "You are Matthew Crawford," the woman said in clear English as she stopped her horse 20 feet from the porch. It wasn't a question. "I am," Matthew replied, stepping forward with Little Fox in his arms. "And you are?" "I am Maria Crow Feather. I believe you have met my grandson." Matthew felt his breath catch. "Your grandson, the child you hold. His Apache name is Running Fox, though you may call him as you wish." Matthew looked down at the baby, then back at Maria. "Why did you leave him by the railroad tracks?" Maria dismounted and approached slowly, her movements non-threatening but purposeful. "May I see the child?" Matthew hesitated, then stepped closer, allowing Maria to look at Little Fox. The baby immediately reached toward her, making happy sounds that Matthew had never heard before. "He knows me," Maria said with a sad smile, "but he also knows you now. This is good." "I don't understand any of this," Matthew said. "Why give me your grandson? Why use my wife's belongings?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying Matthew's face. "Your wife came to me in a vision 3 moons ago. She showed me where her body rests, and she told me about her sadness at leaving you alone. Sarah came to you. The spirits of the dead sometimes speak to those who know how to listen," Maria explained. "Your wife's spirit was troubled. She wanted to help her husband heal, but she could not reach you from the spirit world." Matthew shook his head. "I don't believe in visions." "That does not matter," Maria said gently. "Your wife believed. She showed me her grave and told me to take her personal things. She said they should go to a child who would bring you back to life." "And Running Fox?" "My daughter died giving birth to him. My son was killed by soldiers 2 months later. The boy had no one but me, and I am old. When your wife's spirit came to me, I understood what was needed." Matthew felt overwhelmed by the explanation. "You want me to raise your grandson? I want him to have a father who will love him and teach him to survive in both worlds, native and white. You are a good man, Matthew Crawford. Your wife's spirit would not have chosen poorly." "But he's Apache. I don't know anything about his culture, his heritage." "Then you will learn," Maria said simply, "and I will teach you if you will let me." She reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. This belonged to his mother. He should have it when he is older. Matthew unwrapped the bundle to find a beautifully carved wooden pendant in the shape of a running fox. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny details that spoke of hours of loving work. "How will this work?" Matthew asked. "People in town will ask questions. The law might get involved." "You tell them the truth," Maria suggested. "You found an orphaned child and chose to care for him. There is no law against kindness." Little Fox began to fuss, and Maria held out her arms. Matthew hesitated, then allowed her to take the baby. She spoke to him in Apache, her voice soft and musical, and the child immediately calmed. "He will forget our language if he does not hear it," Maria said. "I would like to visit sometimes, to teach him the old ways alongside the new ones you will show him." "You want to share him?" "I want him to know who he is," Maria replied. "Apache and white, belonging to both peoples. This is his gift and his burden." As Maria prepared to leave, she handed little Fox back to Matthew. The transfer felt different this time, less like temporary care and more like a permanent commitment. "The railroad tracks where you found him," Maria said as she mounted her horse. "That place is special. Your wife walked there often when she was alive, did she not?" Matthew's eyes widened. Sarah had indeed loved to walk along the tracks, especially in the evenings when the sun set over the prairie. She said the rails reminded her that they weren't completely isolated from the world. "How did you know that?" "Your wife told me," Maria said with a knowing smile. "She said it was a place where two paths crossed, like this child's life will be." As the three Apache riders disappeared across the prairie, Matthew looked down at Running Fox, who was now regarding him with those intelligent dark eyes. "Well, little one," Matthew said quietly, "I guess we're really family now." For the first time since Sarah's death, Matthew Crawford felt like he had a future worth living. 2 worlds, 1 family. 6 months later, Matthew's ranch had been transformed from a place of solitude into something resembling a home. Running Fox, now a year old, and walking with unsteady but determined steps, had brought laughter and purpose back into Matthew's life. True to her word, Maria Crowfeather visited monthly, teaching both Matthew and Running Fox about Apache traditions while learning about ranch life herself. The arrangement had evolved into something none of them had expected, an extended family that bridged 2 cultures. "He's getting into everything," Matthew told Maria during one of her visits, watching as Running Fox attempted to climb onto a chair to reach some interesting objects on the kitchen table. "Good," Maria replied with satisfaction. "Curious children become wise adults. Your wife would be pleased to see him so healthy and bold." Matthew had gradually accepted Maria's belief that Sarah's spirit had guided these events. Whether through spiritual intervention or remarkable coincidence, the arrival of Running Fox had healed wounds in Matthew's heart that he thought would never mend. The real test came when the territorial authorities finally arrived. Marshal Robert Hayes rode up to the ranch on a warm spring morning, accompanied by a clerk from the territorial office. Matthew had been expecting this visit for months. Someone was bound to ask questions about the native child living with a white rancher. "Mr. Crawford," Marshal Hayes said, tipping his hat as he dismounted, "I'm here on official business regarding the Indian child reported to be in your care." "Running Fox," Matthew said, lifting the toddler into his arms. "His name is Running Fox. Sir, you're not listed as having legal guardianship of any native children. According to territorial law, Indian children without family should be placed in government schools." Matthew felt his jaw tighten. "He has family. He has me." "That's not how the law works," the clerk interjected. "Native children belong with their own people or in institutions designed to educate them properly." "And what if his people want him here?" Maria's voice came from behind them as she emerged from the house, having arrived earlier that morning. Marshal Hayes turned to face her, his expression wary. "And you are?" "Maria Crowfeather, the child's grandmother. I placed him in Matthew Crawford's care because it was what his parents would have wanted. Ma'am, with respect, that's not a legal arrangement according to territorial law." Maria stepped forward, her bearing regal despite her simple clothing. "Marshal, are you familiar with the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867? "I know of it," Hayes replied cautiously. "Then you know it guarantees certain rights to tribal members regarding the care of their children. I am the child's only living blood relative, and I choose Matthew Crawford as his guardian." The clerk whispered something to Marshal Hayes, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Even so," Hayes said finally, "this arrangement is highly irregular. A white man raising an Apache child is exactly what this territory needs," interrupted a new voice. Joe Martinez had ridden up during the conversation. bringing with him several other ranchers from the area. "Joe," Matthew said with surprise, "what are you doing here?" "Word gets around," Joe replied. "Heard there might be trouble over young running fox. Thought you could use some character witnesses." One by one, the other ranchers spoke up. They talked about Matthew's honesty, his hard work, and the positive change they'd seen in him since taking in the child. Several mentioned that running fox was clearly thriving under Matthew's care. "Marshal," said old Tom Henderson, who owned the neighboring ranch, "I've known Matthew Crawford for 8 years. If he says he's going to raise that boy right, then that's what's going to happen. The child's better off here than in some government school back east." Marshal Hayes looked around at the assembled ranchers, then at Maria, then at Running Fox, who was contentedly playing with Sarah's necklace while sitting in Matthew's arms. "This is highly irregular," Hayes said finally. "But I suppose if the child's grandmother consents and the community supports the arrangement." He paused, clearly struggling with the decision. "I'll file a report stating that the child is being cared for appropriately by a responsible guardian with family consent." After the officials and neighboring ranchers departed, Matthew found himself alone with Maria and Running Fox by the creek where he had first discovered the baby. "Your wife was wise to choose you," Maria said, watching as Running Fox played in the shallow water. "He will grow up understanding both worlds." "What do you think she would say if she could see us now?" Matthew asked. Maria smiled. "I think she would say her work is done. The lonely man she loved has become a father, and her spirit can rest peacefully." As if summoned by their conversation, Running Fox toddled over to Matthew, chattering in the mixture of Apache words and English phrases that had become his unique language. Around his neck, Sarah's necklace caught the afternoon sunlight. "Papa," Running Fox said clearly, having recently mastered the word. It was one of his favorites, along with Grandmama for Maria and Horse for Thunder. Matthew lifted his son, for that's what Running Fox had become, and felt the completeness that had been missing from his life for so long. "Yes, little fox," Matthew said softly. "Papa's here." As the sun set over the Wyoming Territory, 3 generations sat by the creek, a widowed rancher, an Apache grandmother, and a child who represented the possibility of peace between 2 worlds. Sarah's necklace gleamed in the fading light, a tangible link between the past and the future. Matthew had discovered that love could indeed transcend death, that families could be formed by choice rather than blood, and that sometimes the most unexpected gifts came in the smallest packages. The railroad tracks still ran past his property, connecting his remote corner of Wyoming to the wider world. But now they also served as a reminder of the day his real life had begun, the day he found a baby wearing his dead wife's necklace and learned that miracles sometimes came disguised as mysteries. Years later, when Running Fox was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of how a lonely rancher and an Apache grandmother came together to raise him in 2 worlds, united by the love of a woman whose spirit watched over them all.